Bicycling Across America by Matt Ebiner, myself. The year was 1980, and I was 19 years old. I had just finished my first year of college at Mount San Antonio College, Mount SAC. I was majoring in photography, and I had not yet taken a single class in geography. I wanted to travel that summer, but I didn't have much money. So what could I do? I started thinking that maybe I could do a big bike trip. I knew a couple of guys who had ridden their bikes across America a couple of years earlier, and I was intrigued by the stories they told of their experiences. I figured I was in good enough shape from running track and cross country at Mount SAC. I enjoyed challenging myself, and a bike trip across America would certainly be a good challenge. I loved reading maps, and I studied them for hours, wondering what it was like in places like Gallup, New Mexico, Keokuk, Iowa, Painesville, Ohio. This was pre-internet, so it was not possible to do a Google search to get info and to see photos of these places. I didn't really know exactly what to expect, except that these places would be different from Southern California, and I wanted to see them for myself. The idea of a bike trip seemed like a great adventure, a sort of 20th century exploration and discovery. I planned to ride my bike from the southwest corner of the United States at the Mexican-American border at the Pacific Ocean to the Canadian-American border at the Atlantic Ocean, a total distance of about 4,000 miles, and I expected it to take about 50 days. I wanted to average 80 miles a day. So a few hours after I finished my last final exam at Mount SAC, this was at the end of my first year of college, I got a ride down to San Diego. I spent the night at a youth hostel and then got a ride to the Mexican border the next morning, June 12th, 1980. The border fence was nothing substantial back then in 1980. It ended on the sand, and people walked back and forth between Mexico and the USA unimpeded and unmonitored. I pushed my bike across the sand and dipped it in the ocean so that I was in the exact southwest corner of the US. I had a Schwinn Superlatour 10-speed bike that I'd bought a year earlier for $200. Nothing fancy. Everything looked nice and fresh and clean and new on that first day, but it would never look like that again. I had a very tight budget for the trip. I did not carry a single credit card or ATM card. I didn't ask my parents for any money or anybody else. I had $400 for the trip. I expected the trip to take about 50 days, and $100 of that was for the bus ticket I would have to buy to get back home at the end. So I really only had $300 to spend on the way, which worked out to be about $6 a day. Now, this was back in 1980. Things were cheaper back then, so if you convert that to contemporary money, it would be worth about $900 today, which still isn't very much, about $18 a day to live on for 7 weeks. I didn't know anybody on the route, so most nights I camped out at state parks, city parks, churches, and in the backyards of houses where I asked permission. Like this one. I would knock on a random door, and I just pick a house like this white house, looked nice, and I'd go up and I would say, "Hello, I'm riding my bicycle across America, and I was wondering if it would be okay if I set up my tent on your lawn for the night." Now, most people were speechless for a few seconds, and even myself now, when I look back, I think I was pretty brave or naive to be doing that. But most people, they said, okay. I only stayed in a few motels during the trip since my budget was so limited. One of the motels was in Congress, Arizona, where I splurged for a room at the Sierra Vista Motel. I paid $12.36 for a room that I described in my journal as quote-unquote really nice. Even at that price, I asked for a discount. I was really counting my pennies. The lady said no, but I still stayed there. It was really a different era. 1980. Things back then would probably be hard for younger people of today to understand or imagine. There were no digital cameras back then. There were no smartphones back then for taking photos. I carried a full-size 35mm camera with 20 rolls of slide film, 36 exposures each roll, so that means 720 photos for a trip that took about 50 days. So that comes out to be about 15 photos a day, which isn't very much when you're spending the entire day outdoors and you're passing through a lot of different places. And those slides, I had to scan them to make them digital for this presentation. There was no internet back then for planning the trip. Instead, I went to the library. I read a lot of books about bicycling and about bike trips. There was no smartphone, no texting to keep in touch with friends or family far away, or to offer me electronic entertainment, or to take me away from the moment. If I had to make a phone call, I had to find a public phone. And I did call home every day or two because my family was interested in how I was doing, if I was okay, and they were really into it. They put a big map of the USA on the kitchen wall, and every time I called, they would mark where I was, and that way they could track my progress. Back then, there's no GPS, there's no apps for telling you how to get from one place to another. So instead, I carried a lot of paper maps. I had to know how to read those maps, and also asked a lot of directions of locals if I couldn't find what I was looking for. Nowadays, it's so easy just to rely on our phone to answer everything that we might not have to ask a stranger the directions for how to get someplace. There was no social media back then. I couldn't post my progress online, something that nowadays people do to get encouragement or comments or recognition. So instead, I had a lot of silent satisfaction and pride without sharing it through Facebook or Instagram, and I wrote a lot. I wrote over 100 pages in my journal, and I wrote over 100 postcards to friends and family, including a lot of people I met along the way who asked me to send a postcard when I finished to let them know if I made it. And I did. I did send those postcards at the end. I didn't have any music player, no headphones. I had absolutely nothing to be plugged in or recharged. And so instead, I just listened to my surroundings, nature, observed everything around me, and all of this helped me to learn an important life lesson. And that is to be present, to enjoy the place where you are. Don't be distracted by what's happening elsewhere. Enjoy the moment wherever you are, with the people you are with. On the bike trip, I spent 95% of my waking hours outdoors. And since I was going at a much slower speed than a car, I had a lot of time to observe and to absorb my surroundings. The landscape, could feel every uphill and downhill, the natural vegetation, the weather, the wind, the humidity, the heat. Something that you don't really fully experience when you're in an enclosed vehicle, like driving in an air-conditioned car down the highway. I passed through many small towns away from the interstate. I enjoyed traveling on the back roads, which were usually quiet without traffic. This allowed for great photo opportunities because I could stop any place for photos. Unlike in a car where you have to find a place to park, a bike can stop just about anywhere. I met lots of friendly people who were curious in what I was doing, especially when they saw me in front of a supermarket with my parked bike all loaded with gear. These girls were in a small town in Ohio, and one of them said, "I find it hard to believe that you could come all the way from California on a bicycle." And then I explained, I said, well, it's true. I've been on the road for this many days, and I biked from such and such town just this morning. And then they believed me, and they asked, "Are you going to be on TV?" And I was not on TV, but I was in 4 different newspapers in articles that were written about my bike trip. Many people complimented me for what I was doing. They respected my effort, and sometimes they wanted to help me out in a small way. This man in Erie, Pennsylvania, he bought me a Sprite and said, "I like to see young people doing something besides getting into trouble." At the end of the 3rd day, I crossed the Colorado River into Arizona, and I was very apprehensive about the next day's ride across the desert. Day 4 was an 85-mile stretch through the Arizona desert from Yuma, Arizona to Quartzsite, without a single town in between. There was only one building on that route, a cafe about 55 miles north of Yuma, 30 miles from Quartzsite. I was worried about biking so far through the desert with only one place to get water. So I started from Yuma at 3:45 a.m., well before sunrise, in the hopes of spending the middle part of the day at the cafe so that I wouldn't be biking in the worst heat. I reached the cafe at 8:15 a.m., but it didn't open until 10 a.m. I needed to refill my water, and the only water at the cafe was inside, so I had to wait. I didn't want to push on for 3 more hours in the desert without a full supply of water. I went into the cafe as soon as they opened at 10, and I was their only customer for a long time. I stayed at the cafe for hours, writing in my journal, sipping the drinks that I bought, and slowly nibbling the food that I ordered. At the time, I had not taken any geography classes, remember. I thought that the hottest time of the day should be around 12 noon or 1 o'clock when the sun is highest in the sky. By 12 noon, it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. I thought it was going to start cooling down in the early afternoon, and then I would start biking again. But when I checked the temperature at 2 p.m., it was 102. What? At 3 p.m., it was 103. And a short while later, the temperature topped out at 104. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the hottest time of day is not at 12 noon, but more like 2 to 4 p.m. That was one of many geographical lessons that I learned during my trip across America. I spent 8 hours there at Stone Cabin Cafe and finally left at 4:15 p.m. It was still hot, but I was anxious to move on. At the cafe, I paid 70 cents for a warm gallon of water to carry with me. It was the first time in my entire life I had paid for water, and the only time of the entire trip that I bought water. Otherwise, I always relied on water from taps, garden hoses, and drinking fountains. As I gained elevation in Arizona, I noticed the gradual change of vegetation. All of this was more noticeable since I was spending so much time outdoors traveling at a slow speed. So this was another geographical lesson that I learned about the effect of elevation on climate and vegetation, getting cooler and more vegetated as I went up in altitude, elevation. The most beautiful spot in the first week of writing was Oak Creek Canyon near Sedona, Arizona. Sedona wasn't as popular in 1980 as it is now, so the excellent road through the canyon was not too busy. It was a tough climb to leave Oak Creek Canyon, but at least I was traveling light for a few days. I wasn't carrying any gear for 4 days because my brother Chris and sister Therese drove out to meet me, and they carried my gear. They met me at spots during the day, and we camped together at night, and it was much easier when I didn't have to carry all the 40 pounds of stuff that I normally had loaded on the back of my bicycle. I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time, the most spectacular place I had ever seen. I didn't know about the geological history of the Grand Canyon at the time, but started to realize how magnificent America's natural beauty is. And this brought me to geographical lesson number 3. America is truly beautiful. I have traveled to 154 countries as of 2020, and I have learned that there is no country on earth with so much natural beauty as the USA. It was great having my brother and sister out there for 4 days. It made it much easier, and it was always nice to have their company during meals and camping. On the day they left, it was hard to say goodbye, and I even had tears in my eyes knowing that they were heading back to the comforts of home while I still had many weeks of hard work ahead of me before I would be able to enjoy those comforts. The day they left was a very tough day of 100 miles for me, riding with my full load again on bad roads with badly cracked pavement, and at one point a long ascent that lasted more than 2 hours. I felt like I was dying on the uphill and told myself, just keep going, just get to Cross Canyon, a small town that I had seen on the map. That was where I planned to buy some food and something cold to drink. I got to Cross Canyon only to find the only store in town closed because it was Sunday. My body was low on calories and I was almost out of food, but I had no other option. I had to keep going. At one point, I was on another long uphill. I stopped riding on the side of the road. I just had to eat something. I looked in my bag and all I had was a can of ravioli that my brother had left with me when they drove home. I was so hungry, I ate it right out of the can without heating it up, and it was still terrible. I felt so exhausted that I rolled out my sleeping pad on the dirt next to the road. I lay down, almost went to sleep. I felt dead. But I got up, I kept going. I reached the summit on that road of 7,750 feet. It was the highest point of the entire trip. I hadn't even realized I was gaining so much elevation since it was a tilted plateau. I shot this photo with a full-size tripod that I was carrying. I continued into New Mexico and towards Gallup, and I had to fight a strong crosswind that made the ride extra tough. I really started questioning myself whether I wanted to continue with this trip. It just did not seem very fun at that point. When I reached Gallup, I went to a Catholic church. It was a Sunday, and I wanted to attend Mass, so I attended the evening Mass there. And then I spoke with the priest afterwards, a very friendly German priest, and I told him what I was doing and said that I was camping out each night. He allowed me to camp in the backyard of the rectory. I set up my tent, and then he invited me inside to chat. We had a great conversation, and he was a wonderful priest. I told him about my trip, how tough the day had been, and how I was unsure about whether I wanted to keep going. He was very kind and understanding, and he spoke some encouraging words that helped recharge my enthusiasm. I got a good night's sleep in my tent. In the morning, I woke up and they invited me in to have a delicious waffle breakfast. And as I left, the priest blessed me. I had gone from feeling so down the previous afternoon, and then in a matter of just 12 hours, I was feeling 100% better. And this taught me an important life lesson early in the trip. And I told myself to always remember that the tough times are usually temporary. They don't last forever. Be patient and stay positive, and things are bound to get better. Eastern New Mexico is on the high plains. It's mostly a gradual downhill traveling eastward, and it's a region where the sky is dramatic every summer afternoon. It's because of a geographical concept that I had never studied at that point, but how the clouds form from the convection happening on summer afternoons of the hot air rising up. I didn't know even the concept of convection at all at that time, but I did know that the weather was very changeable throughout the day, often resulting in magnificent sunsets. This was in Las Vegas, New Mexico, not Las Vegas, Nevada. But in the same place, in the morning, the clouds were usually gone, and there would be a perfectly clear sunrise. Another geographical lesson that was very obvious, something that I did know about before the trip, was that the winds in the USA usually blow from the west to the east. I knew about this in advance of the trip, and that's a big reason why I chose the route that I did, biking from west to east, so that I could have more tailwind, and that is the direction that almost all cross-country bicyclists take when they go across the U.S. I met another long-distance bicyclist in New Mexico named Wesley, who was riding from California to Kansas. We crossed the eastern part of New Mexico, a little bit of the corner of Texas, the panhandle of Oklahoma. This photo here was on the border of Texas, Oklahoma. Notice the name Texhoma, right on the border of Texas, Oklahoma. And we rode together for a few days. We passed through the old town of Dodge City, Kansas, with a recreated Old West Street showing what it looked like in the 1870s, with stagecoach rides and gunfight reenactments. Wesley invited me to stay at his parents' house in Ellsworth, Kansas. I was a little envious that he was finishing his trip while I still had over 2,000 miles to go. But I did enjoy a very comfortable sleep in their guest room. However, in the middle of the night, I was dreaming that I was sleeping in my own bed back home, something that I was craving after so many nights of camping in a tent, in a sleeping bag. As I was dreaming, I half awoke and I thought I was back home. I thought I had given up without completing my trip across America. And as I lay there in the dark, I got mad at myself and I told myself, I am going back to where I quit, and I am going to continue until I finish my trip across the country. I then fully awoke. I realized I was still in Kansas, and I was glad that I was there and that I hadn't given up. And after that night, I never seriously considered giving up. July 4th was the hottest day on historical record in central Kansas, 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was also the longest day of the trip, 135 miles. Thank God I had a tailwind that day. Now, I passed through miles and miles of wheat fields, one of many kinds of agriculture that I saw on the trip. wheat fields of Kansas to the corn and soybeans of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana led to another geographical lesson that I learned, that America is a great agricultural country, the best in the world, really, something that urban Americans don't think much about. I passed through many small towns that seemed to be dying, which brought me to another geographical lesson. Population is declining in rural America. Families with small farms often have sold their land to larger farmers and they've moved out. And a lot of young people move out because they want job opportunities and the excitement of a big city. On that 135-mile ride on the 4th of July, I followed an old highway that paralleled a newer interstate. The old highway was pretty empty. I had the road mostly to myself, but at one point I heard a car slowly approaching me from behind. Now, usually a car would approach and then drive on past, but this one did not pass me. For 10 seconds, I heard it right behind me, going at my speed, not passing by. I suddenly remembered all the warnings that friends had given me before the trip, saying it was a dangerous thing I was planning to do, to bike across America by myself. They said that I'd probably get robbed or killed out there. They recommended that I bring a weapon, maybe a gun. I did not bring a gun. I did not bring any kind of weapon. But as that car was over my shoulder, I started to think maybe they were right. I thought that maybe something terrible was about to happen on this hot, lonely road. I gathered my courage to look over my shoulder. I looked over my shoulder, and this car is right behind me, and there's a guy leaning out the passenger side window with his arms stretched out towards me. And then I saw he's holding something in his hand. But thank goodness it was not a weapon. He was holding a can of Budweiser beer, and he handed it to me, and he said, "Hey, you look kind of hot out there." At the end of that long 4th of July ride of 135 miles, I stopped in a small Kansas town and picked a random house to ask if I could camp on their grass. The man there was very friendly. At first I was going to pitch my tent, but then he said I could stay in an old closed-down motel cabin that his family owned. It was a bit dusty and dirty inside, but it had running water and a bed. They brought me some ice water and homemade ice cream. I loved the kindness of the Kansans, and in my opinion, it was the friendliest state of all 16 states I passed through. The next day, they made an excellent breakfast of eggs, ham, pancakes, orange juice, and milk. A lot better than the basic pancake breakfasts I made for myself on my camp stove every morning. The day I reached Missouri, it was hot again, mid-90s and humid, and at one point I stopped at a store to treat myself to an ice cream. I noticed a single ice cream sandwich cost 39 cents, but a box of 6 ice cream sandwiches cost $1.19, which is about 20 cents a piece. So that was a good deal. I was about to buy the box of 6, but then I noticed there was a box of 12 that cost $1.69. Now that was an awesome deal because that was less than 15 cents a sandwich. And so I knew that was the best bargain, so I bought the box of 12. I ate the first ice cream sandwich, and it was great. I ate a second, and it was still pretty good. By the time I ate the third ice cream sandwich, it began to taste like nothing, but I didn't want to be wasteful, so I ate a fourth one and a fifth one, and I got to the 6th one, and I was really forcing myself. But by then I saw it as a challenge, kind of like my bike trip, to see if I could make it across the country. I wanted to see if I could eat 12 ice cream sandwiches. So I kept going, but I could not do it. I finished 8 ice cream sandwiches and just could not take one more bite. In fact, it took years before I ever felt like eating another ice cream sandwich. I reached Keokuk, Iowa with a broken spoke that I could not repair myself. I went to a phone booth and checked the yellow pages for bicycle repair shops, and there was only one listing in the phone book for a place called Tri-State TV and Appliances. It didn't sound like a bike repair shop, but I had to get my bike fixed. I found the place and walked in past the television sets, washing machines, and other appliances. I asked the man there, "Do you do bicycle repairs?" And he said, "Yeah, but we're about a week behind in doing the work." My heart sunk a bit, and I told him I was riding my bike across the country and I really hoped to fix a broken spoke today. I didn't want to wait a week in Keokuk, Iowa for a bike repair. I told him I just had to get the freewheel off and then I could do the rest of the repair. And the man said, "Well, why don't you come around the back and I'll help you get started." We went to the back and he not only removed the freewheel, he did all of the work. He replaced the spoke, repacked the bearings in fresh grease, and trued the wheel. I was so grateful that he had dropped everything he was doing to repair my bike, and I told him, "Thank you so much. How much do I owe you for this?" "Nothing," he replied. "Anyone who has the gumption to ride a bike across the country deserves a little help." I love that guy. I camped unofficially that night in a park along the Mississippi River, and this was technically illegal since everyone was supposed to be out of the park by 11:30 p.m. I went to sleep by 9 p.m. or so. I always was going to sleep pretty early and getting an early start. And I found a fairly secluded spot where I could put the tent, but it was still visible from a small road passing through the park. At 10 p.m. I was asleep in the tent when I was awakened by the sound of motorcycles that stopped right outside my tent on the road. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel approaching my tent. I started getting nervous because I was really very vulnerable. I had everything inside the tent, including the bicycle, all my gear. The tent door was zipped up, but there's no lock on the door. There's no real security. And so I felt like these guys could mess me up if they want. So then I heard one voice. One guy said, "Yeah, it's a tent, all right. Hey, anybody in there?" And I said, "Yeah, what's up?" And the guy said, "Oh, nothing. I'm Bill. He's Bob. See you later." And he left. Reaching the Mississippi River was a milestone, the mighty river I had heard about for many years. This was the first time I had seen it or had seen any river so large. I was surprised at how muddy it looked, which brings me to geographical lesson number 8. Big rivers are not blue, but they are brown or gray from all of the sediment, the silt and clay, that they carry. A few days later, I saw Lake Michigan for the first time. I had never seen the Great Lakes before. My dad and brother Brian had flown out to Chicago, and they carried my gear for 4 days while I rode. We ate at restaurants and stayed at motels each night. It felt like I was living a life of luxury after my nightly dinners of canned food that I ate while camping out. I saw this unusual sign in Indiana where the Amish people live. The Amish try to remain traditional and reject much of the technology of the modern world. For example, they ride horse-drawn carriages like you'd see in the 1800s instead of cars or trucks. We even saw a couple of carriages parked outside a pizza place with the horses tied to a lamppost. So they're not 100% old-fashioned. They'll still go to a modern restaurant, but they are the most traditional people of America. Ohio was the 11th state on the trip, and in my opinion, it was the second friendliest state I passed through after Kansas. In Wakeman, Ohio, I met this greatest bunch of kids. There were 6 of them who were very interested in what I was doing. I went to a supermarket where I bought some food, and they saw me and they started talking to me. There were 6 of them. They're very interested in what I was doing. They gave me their addresses so that I could write postcards to them, and I did when I finished the trip. They gave me some ice water, and then they rode with me for a couple of miles when I left their town. And it was awesome. I felt like a VIP receiving an official escort through their town. Which brings me to lesson number 9. In my opinion, small town folks are friendlier than city folks. One night I camped in a sandy riverbed in a state park. It was soft for sleeping and it was secluded, but the mosquitoes were horrible. When I took down the tent the next morning, I was getting eaten up by the mosquitoes. In my rush to pack up the tent and get out of there, I accidentally left one of my tent poles in the sandy riverbed. The next day, I camped at a house in Brunswick, Ohio, and that's when I found that I only had 11 tent poles and not 12. Now, the friendly man of the house was watching me set up the tent and asked me if there was a problem, and I told him I was missing a pole, and he said, "Let me take a look at one of your poles." He looked at it, then he said, "I might be able to do something to help you." So he took my pole to his garage and he measured its length. He then pulled out one of his own fishing poles and pulled out a saw, and I could barely believe that he might destroy one of his fishing poles to help me out, but that's exactly what he did. He cut the pole and then stapled a piece of aluminum tubing to one end of it. He handed it to me and said, "This should work." And it did. I used that replacement pole for the rest of the trip. The humidity and rainfall increases eastward across the Midwest, so Ohio was very beautiful with all of its forests. In Painesville, Ohio, I was resting in a park in the middle of the day when a young woman came up to me, started chatting with me, said she was a journalist at the local newspaper, and asked where I was traveling and if she could interview me for an article. So she interviewed me, wrote an article about me for the local newspaper, and she mailed me a copy of that article. It was one of 4 articles written about my bike trip in various newspapers. The other 3 were in Missouri, Maine, and New Brunswick. My trip had a very short stretch through Pennsylvania, a beautiful corner of the state, the northwest corner of Pennsylvania, through a state park called Presque Isle, with nice forests and a short shoreline on Lake Erie. That's the only shore that Pennsylvania has, and the narrow beach was crowded, busy with a lot of local visitors enjoying the beach, and it really made me appreciate the big wide beaches we have in Southern California. And this was another geographical lesson that I learned, was that most beaches in the USA are not as good as Southern California beaches. I think the best beaches in the US are in Hawaii, Florida, and California. New York was the 13th state I passed through. Now, this was upstate New York, so I did not pass through New York City. Upstate New York is beautiful, with its farms and forests and mountains, but the mountains are a lot different than the mountains in the western U.S. Another very noticeable geographical lesson is that the eastern U.S. has mountains that are much lower and more rounded, since they are older and they've been eroded down more than the younger mountains of the western U.S. that are taller and more jagged. The forests were increasingly beautiful as I traveled eastward. Vermont, with the Green Mountains, is a beautiful state. The name Vermont, in fact, literally means green mountain, although in the fall there's There's all the colorful trees with the orange, yellow, and red leaves getting ready to drop. I finally reached Maine after 45 days. I was so excited to be in the last state of the trip. The forests in the Northeast are similar to the forests you would see in the Northwest, like Oregon and Washington. Mostly conifers that are green year-round. And it's cool even in summertime since it's quite far north, just like as if you were in western Washington in summer. I passed through Acadia National Park, only the second national park of the entire trip, the Grand Canyon being the other one. Beautiful, although I would say that the western U.S. is even more beautiful. After 4,000 miles and 49 days of riding, I reached Calais, Maine, on the U.S.-Canadian border. I crossed into the province of New Brunswick, Canada, but no one was there to congratulate me. I didn't have any communication with family and friends back home. Remember, no smartphones. And so it wasn't so easy to share my excitement of finishing. I couldn't post something on Facebook or Instagram that I had completed my journey, and I couldn't get all that online recognition or comments. So these two kids were the first people I saw after crossing the bridge, and I was so excited. I told them, I've just finished riding my bike all the way from California, all the way across the USA. And this boy, he was totally unimpressed. And he said, if I had a 10-speed, I could do that too. Well, I went to the local newspaper office and I told them what I'd done, and they were a little bit more interested. The girl at the front desk said, let me go get the sports editor. So they interviewed me, wrote an article, and mailed me a copy. After that, I had a long journey home on a Greyhound bus for 84 hours. The trip itself had taken 49 days and 4,000 miles to reach the Canadian border at the Atlantic. I had completed one of the biggest goals I have ever set for myself. It was tough at times, but the experiences, memories, and sense of accomplishment made it all worthwhile. I didn't only learn about America, I learned about my own capabilities. And more importantly, I learned important life lessons that have stayed with me ever since. The bike trip made me realize the value of the 4 P's. Perseverance. We are capable of great things if we persevere. In other words, if we don't give up, we can do a lot. Patience. Everything good or worthwhile takes time. Accomplishments take time. Positive attitude. To stay positive and to be confident that you can achieve a goal, that confidence helps you to persevere. And to be present, to enjoy the place where you are and the people you are with. It's a little bit tougher in the modern day with all the electronic diversions and distractions that we have, but it's still something to strive for. My favorite sign of the entire trip was this sign that I saw in upstate New York with a quote by the great American poet Robert Frost from a poem he wrote over 100 years ago in the year 1916. I took the road less traveled by, and that made all the difference. And I think that can be rephrased in contemporary language by saying, step out of your comfort zone, and that can make all the difference. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And here are some statistics about the trip. Once again, thank you very much.